whenever skeptics bring a question the reliability of the New Testament because of two specific things. One being that they were written anonymously, and two, they were written several decades after the lifetime of Jesus.
Right.
How should I address those 2 points?
My core issue isn't that the Gospels are anonymous or late. My issue is that they are, by their very nature, propaganda, written by believers for the purpose of promoting a religious movement. When a document's purpose is theological persuasion, not objective reporting, then of course a skeptic is going to question its reliability, especially when it describes extraordinary events that conveniently support the exact theology the writers want you to accept. Also, the Gospels were selected from a much larger pool of competing texts, with the official 4 only becoming canon centuries later after plenty of church politics. If you think that's a recipe for unbiased history, I've got some ancient Roman campaign posters to sell you.
I would ask them, Danny, to say, all right, what is your standard for a document in the ancient world to be reliable?
So now the Gospels just need to pass the ancient world standards test? That's a pretty low bar for what's supposed to be the divinely inspired Word of God. Historians reconstruct the past by analyzing written documents, oral testimonies, and physical evidence. Their toolbox is limited to human experience and natural explanations. In simple terms, history deals with what people write, not whether a supernatural event absolutely occurred. If your best defense for the Gospels is they're just as reliable as other old documents, that's not exactly a glowing endorsement for a text that claims miraculous events, resurrection, and cosmic-level stakes.
I would say you give me the standard when it comes to both how we determine the authorship of a work and how long after the events it describes it was composed. So I might say, look, are you saying a book is not reliable if it was written more than 20 years, or let's say, more than 40 years after the events it purports to describe, 40 or 50 years. If it was written, let's say, 100 years later. If that's the case, then they're going to have to discount the vast majority of ancient history. For example, the claim that Hannibal crossed the Alps with war elephants was written down 50 or 60 years later by a Roman historian. The accounts of Alexander the Great, his biography, was 400 years later. The first accounts we have of William Wallace in England from the movie Braveheart are from a blind minstrel that were written 150 years later. So the problem is, I would ask them, what's your standard? And if the Gospels don't meet your standard, you're going to have to throw out almost all of ancient history as well. If you don't throw out ancient history, then that means you have a double standard for the Bible then, which is unacceptable.
The argument basically boils down to, if you don't accept what these cult followers wrote in their fairy tale book, then you shouldn't accept anything any ancient historian ever said. Okay, so what's the plan then? Accept everything ever written in antiquity or toss it all in the bin? Very practical. And then Muslims jump in with, well, if you don't accept the moon-splitting story, then you must also throw out Josephus. When you scrub out the obvious bias and propaganda from ancient historians, what's left is usually normal human stuff: wars, politics, invasions, petty drama, things that don't require rewriting the laws of physics. But moon-splitting, resurrection, that's not just unlikely, it's absurd, and no amount of testimony, especially testimony coming from people already convinced of the religion, is going to suddenly make it reasonable. That's a problem with your religion. And even if historians did treat Hannibal's elephants or Alexander's achievements as 100% reliable, despite fanboys writing much of it, you'd still need to explain why historians think those events are plausible. You don't get to wave your hand and say, well, historians believe in these events, so you should believe in zombies.
So, and I would say, though, when it comes to written within a few decades of the events they describe, that is still within the framework for eyewitnesses to accurately record events. I was watching on the Library of Congress, they had old videos of World War I veterans that were recorded in the 80s and 90s. These are people who are talking about events that happened 70 or 80 years later that were as clear as if they had just been there yesterday. So if we trust that, then I would say, all right, do you trust people who describe when they fought? Like, if you talk to a Vietnam War veteran today, would you say he couldn't possibly remember Vietnam? He couldn't. No, we wouldn't say that. They could remember it, even though that occurred 50 years ago. And that would put us in the same framework as the apostles. But I would say the Gospels were written. There's good evidence that that Matthew, Mark, and Luke were written before 70 AD.
The majority of scholars reject that ultra-early dating. And the real problem isn't simply how many decades passed until the Gospels were written. I get it. I'm fine with accounts being written decades later, even trusting memories passed down, maybe even from an eyewitness to a young man, then to his son or another friend. Some people believe oral tradition plus careful record-keeping can preserve accuracy. My Muslim friends would agree with you 100% on that principle, they just apply it to different stories. The real question is how we check that the stories weren't changed along the way. These texts were written many years later, in another place, in another language, by people we don't actually know. They come from Greek-speaking writers who never claimed to be eyewitnesses. And if we don't know their sources or how reliable those sources were, then it becomes hard to talk about trustworthiness. And about those war veterans, if one of them started giving you a story that sounded like a Rambo action scene where physics takes a vacation, would you still treat that as reliable testimony? That's the problem with the Gospels. It's not about whether someone can remember things decades later. It's about what kind of stories they're telling and whether we can check how those stories were handled over time.
As for the authorship, Danny, I would say to them, how do they know the Gospels are anonymous? They might say, well, the Gospels in their text never say who their author is. It's just ascribed to it. I would then ask them, how is it that in the ancient church we have never found a manuscript saying that one gospel was actually written by somebody else? The manuscripts always align. It's always Mark's gospel, always has the Gospel of Mark at the top of it.
All this really proves is, by the time our surviving manuscripts were copied, centuries later, the church had already picked the traditional names. It doesn't tell us who actually penned the originals. We don't have the autograph copies. So this agreement just reflects a later tradition, not first-hand knowledge. If anything, the lack of any alternate attributions shows that once the church chose a name, the scribes simply stuck with it. Not because they verified it, but because tradition locked it in. That's also why most critical scholars dismiss the claim that those names prove eyewitness authorship. And what kind of all-knowing God would orchestrate a sacred text that's supposed to sway future generations, yet leave the original authorship so shaky that historians can't even agree on who wrote it or when? If your plan to sell the story to future skeptics depends on historical method, that's one massive loophole to leave open.
And by the way, if they were anonymous, strictly speaking, why would you pick nobodies like Mark or Luke or lower tier apostles like Matthew? Why would you pick these if you're just kind of, the Gospels that are made up usually have names like Philip and Peter and things like that. That doesn't discount John's Gospel. We have very good historical evidence for John.
Mark isn't a nobody in early Christian circles. He's conveniently linked to Peter. Luke is conveniently linked to Paul. Matthew is one of the 12, so he's not exactly the janitor. Early Christian communities may have attributed these works to figures like Mark and Luke precisely because they were known as associates of more prominent apostles, lending the text a degree of authority without directly claiming apostolic authorship. What we're doing is speculations. This is not evidence.
Just kind of adding on to that.
Sure.
Because they also bring up the fact that if it is anonymous, because I have read a few historical papers, and a lot of them do say that there is good reason. I don't remember the specifics of them, but there are good reasons to think they're anonymous, and that they were compiled and written off of oral tradition, and that's the other part of why some skeptics claim, because it was passed through oral tradition.
Right.
That's just the other aspect of it.
Yeah, and what I would say, Danny, is that, there's going to be liberal, you can hold that view and still be Catholic. There are liberal Catholic biblical scholars who claim that the Gospels are anonymous and weren't really written by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Though I would say, though, that the consensus of the church's history places a very, very heavy weight on that consensus of who the authors were.
Trent's whole case basically boils down to, look, for a really long time, a lot of people in our tradition have believed this, so that should count for a lot. By that exact same logic, the Islamic tradition has a massive, centuries-old consensus that the hadiths, like Sahih al-Bukhari, are meticulously preserved eyewitness accounts of what Muhammad said and did. That consensus has way more people and just as much historical weight within its own tradition. It's almost like consensus is only sacred when it's your team chanting it. What you have is one charismatic guy starts preaching, gathers followers, builds a movement, and then the community treats the stories about him like priceless treasure. Well, you've just described every religion ever, including the one you're defending. Of course they agreed. They were all in the same belief bubble, copying the same stories, trying to keep the movement alive. That's how traditions grow. None of that gets us any closer to verifying whether the stories actually happened, especially when the earliest written versions show up decades later in a different country and language.
But so I would to take from that, they say, well, they are anonymous. I'd still press them. Well, what are your reasons for it? Because when we have like the letter to the Hebrews, for example, I would say that is an anonymous letter. We don't know who the author is. We know it has an apostolic origin to it somehow. But people in the early church ascribed it to a variety of individuals. We never see that with the Gospels.
So let me ask the obvious question. If anonymity is such a deal breaker, why is Hebrews in the New Testament? You literally just admitted nobody knows who wrote it, the early church threw around multiple guesses, and yet it still made the cut. So clearly authorship isn't a consistent standard for you. It only becomes a problem when skeptics point out the same issue in the Gospels. That only shows how a religious community curates a library. The church wasn't asking, who actually wrote this, and can we verify it? They were asking, does this line up with our theology?
Now, it's true the Gospels don't name their own authors, and some people say, well, Matthew refers to himself in the third person, so clearly Matthew didn't write Matthew. Well, Josephus refers to himself in the third person, and he was a Jewish historian that lived in the 1st century.
I agree. It's in third person, so Matthew didn't write it, is a pretty flimsy argument. Plenty of ancient writers talked about themselves like they were action figure characters, so that alone proves nothing. But here's what does matter. If Matthew was really an eyewitness apostle, why is he copying huge chunks of Mark, word for word in Greek, a text likely written by someone who wasn't an eyewitness at all?
Matthew includes a lot of Mark's material, so Matthew couldn't have written it. Well, Mark was the traveling companion of Peter, so it would make sense for Matthew, as a lower tier apostle, to go straight to the source, somebody who was in close contact with Peter, the leader of the church, and the person who was one of the closest people to Jesus during his earthly ministry.
That's just excuses, not how a real eyewitness tells a story, no matter how low tier you want to call him. If you witnessed the most important events in human history, you don't outsource your memoir to Peter's intern. You don't need to borrow your buddy's notes. You were in the room. Lower tier or not, the man supposedly lived with Jesus, watched the miracles, heard the teachings firsthand. Yet somehow the guy who wasn't an eyewitness, Mark, becomes the foundation Matthew leans on? So why are we giving Matthew a pass? The simplest explanation is right in front of us. The book wasn't written by Matthew the Apostle. It was written later by someone who respected Mark's version and expanded it.
Now, with oral tradition, I would say to them, look, this isn't a case of tradition being handed down over hundreds of years being distorted. A.N. Sherwin-White was a Greco-Roman historian who said that it takes more than 2 generations for myth to overtake the historical core of a narrative that is passed on through oral tradition. And we know the Gospels were written within 1 generation of the lifetime of Jesus' followers. So
Sherwin-White didn't run a study. He didn't test anything. He didn't even say what Trent claimed he said. Just took one vague remark about Herodotus, based on a single example, and mutated it into, myths can't grow fast, therefore the Gospels are historically rock solid. First, who decided that the myth corruption timer is precisely 2 generations? Is that like a scientific law? Did Sherwin-White run clinical trials on myth formation? Because last I checked, myths and legends can pop up instantly, especially when you have a motivated community that really wants to believe something. Richard Carrier has a blog post breaking this down, and in it he cites historian Peter Brunt's 1964 response to Sherwin-White. Brunt basically says, comparing Jesus to Alexander the Great doesn't work. His exact words, Sherwin-White has done me the honor to cite a comparison I drew with our accounts of Alexander, whom some of his own contemporaries treated as a god. It is true that Alexander's history was still able to be written, but Alexander's career was public in a sense which that of Jesus in Galilee was not. If the Synoptic Gospels reflect traditions that grew and were remolded in the changing experience of the Palestinian Church, how can we objectively distinguish between what is original and what is accretion, seeing that the Gospels themselves must be almost our only evidence for that changing experience? Sherwin-White has not provided, as he thinks, conclusive reasons to reject the view that the history of Jesus' mission can't be written. Translation: Sherwin-White's analogy doesn't work. Jesus wasn't a public, widely documented figure like Alexander, and the Gospels give us no reliable baseline to separate fact from later additions. Carrier also quotes Komarnitsky, who makes the same point even more bluntly. The Gospels are an understandable exception to what classical historians normally deal with, because classical historians rarely, if ever, deal with the written records of a highly revered religious figure who had very little contemporary significance to anyone but his followers when he was alive, and to his worshippers after his death, and where the entire written record comes only from those who worshipped him. Because of this, using the myth growth rates observed in other ancient records as a baseline to say what should be observed in the Gospels is a mistaken approach. In other words, Sherwin-White's one example from Herodotus doesn't apply to the Gospels at all. Different context, different authors, different motives, different documentation, different everything.